Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Ana Ortega. I am an advocacy strategist at Human Rights First, and I will be moderating today's conversation. Again, thank you so much for joining this roundtable on asylum, where we will be discussing the current state of asylum, the situation at the southern border, along with the challenges to the asylum system and the welcoming efforts. During this call, you will hear from experts on asylum and humanitarian protections who are located in key regions of the southern border and are doing the very difficult task of protecting asylum seekers and the asylum system in general. These are by far a very difficult tasks, and I am very excited that they have made the time to be here with us today. Before we get started, a few housekeeping rules. Please be mindful that this webinar is being recorded and also transmitted via Facebook Live. And if you have any questions throughout the conversation, please feel free to put them in the chat function. We will make sure to leave some time at the end of the conversation to address those questions. Before introducing our panel, I would like to thank We Are All America for hosting the event and also acknowledge our co-hosts, Human Rights First, Church World Service, Welcome with Dignity, International Rescue Committee, Raíces, New Mexico Hospitality Coalition, and the Immigration Defenders Law Center of Los Angeles. Now let me introduce the panels that are with us today. We have Joyce Noche from the Legal Services Director at Immigrant Defenders Law Center. Welcome, Joyce. We have Blake Vera, Bond Fund Director at Raíces. Hello, Blake. We have Frida Adams, faith-based organization liaison at the Hospitality New Mexico Coalition. And we also have Luis Guerra, who is interim campaign manager for Welcome with Dignity campaign. And we also have Reverend Noel Anderson, director of grassroots organizing with Church World Services. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for making time to be with us. Before we get started, I would like to provide a few updates and acknowledge the current situation of emergency in Afghanistan and in Haiti. Our brothers and sisters are in desperate need of help and urgent action from the Biden administration. As these situations in both Afghanistan and Haiti continue to develop and escalate, we are urging Congress and the Biden administration to halt deportations and expulsions to Haiti, to return any Haitians who were eligible for TPS to the United States, and to welcome Haitian asylum seekers. For our sisters and brothers in Afghanistan, the Biden administration should create a robust and immediate humanitarian response to assist Afghans in danger, and also expand opportunities for Afghans to seek refuge in the United States, as well as expedite the process for special immigrant visas. And further, any Afghans currently living in the United States must immediately be given temporary protective status to avoid any threat of deportation. Lastly, and a very important update, last week, a federal judge in Texas ordered the Biden administration to reinstate MPP, the Migrant Protection Protocols, which was a very disappointing decision. This decision is currently being challenged by the ACLU and other organizations who have filed an amicus brief, and a decision remains pending. So it's just, we just wanted to share with you this updates on this current situations, and we hope that you find this information useful. And now let's go back to the current state of asylum at the border. The Biden administration continues to misuse Title 42 And by doing so, the US is continue to block asylum seekers from requesting protection at the ports of entry, and also blocking those asylum seekers who cross elsewhere to request this protection. This, with the help of an exemption process, many of these asylum seekers have been able to enter the US to request protection, but this process has recently ended. If we add the high levels of violence, kidnapping, human rights abuses, corruption by the Mexican authorities, and COVID-19, you can only imagine what these individuals and asylum seekers are being forced to face while they remain stranded at the Mexican border. Before passing it to our panelists, we would like to share with you a recording of a testimony of a couple from Venezuela who was stranded in Mexico during the migrant protection protocols. We hope you enjoy this recording, and I will pause so that we can play the video.
Nuestra historia de migración forzada comienza porque en nuestro país, Venezuela, está siendo gobernado por un dictador. Recibimos persecución, nos torturaron y debido a esto tuvimos que huir. Fueron muchas las amenazas hacia nosotros, hacia nuestra familia. Los medios de comunicación no siempre muestran totalmente la realidad por lo que pasamos los migrantes. El trato que le dan a las personas mayores, a los niños, a personas discapacitadas o con algún tipo de enfermedad no es el correcto.
Lo más difícil ha sido dejar nuestras amistades.
Comenzar desde cero, no una, sino varias veces, pero todo por un bien. La parte más gratificante de nuestro viaje fue llegar aquí, recibir esa protección que tanto necesitábamos y hace tantos años estábamos buscando, sentirnos seguros, encontrarnos con un poquito de familia que teníamos aquí. Quisiéramos que las personas entiendan sobre la realidad de lo que es pedir asilo o refugio. No es algo fácil, es para personas que realmente lo necesitan. Es importante que Estados Unidos acoja a esas personas porque muchos de nosotros estamos siendo perseguidos o amenazados de muerte en el país del que somos. Aquí nos sentimos un poquito más seguros, nos sentimos realmente protegidos.
We hope you enjoyed this recording, and we thank the very brave asylum seekers who offered to share their story with us today. Now, I would like to introduce our first panelist, Joyce Noche, who is the Legal Services Director at the Immigration Defenders Law Center. Joyce is going to talk to us about Title 42, briefly touch on MPP, and the challenges that her organization is facing when representing asylum seekers who are stranded in Mexico. Joyce, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna. And thank you all for this opportunity to participate and for taking the time to talk about these issues and challenges facing asylum seekers at our border. I am the Legal Services Director for Immigrant Defenders. We are based in Los Angeles, but we did open an office in San Diego to start working on the issues that were affecting asylum seekers at our border back in 2018. What I hope to accomplish today in my brief time with you all is just to give a little bit of a glimpse of what it's like to seek asylum at the border and some of the challenges that asylum seekers face not only the legal challenges, but also the basic necessities of life challenges, being safe, having a roof over your head, seeking care. These are all of the challenges that our clients face amidst trying to apply for asylum. So let me just start from the beginning and kind of talk about our work. We are a legal services organization. All of our work is done pro bono, so we do not charge our clients for representation. We operate under what we call a universal representation model. So we don't take cases based on eligibility for relief or merit. Rather, we take cases up to capacity because it's our belief that no immigrant should be forced to go to court alone. In that way, we do represent a wide range of immigrant communities, including longstanding residents and also recent arrivals. All of our clients are indigent and must have a connection to the state of California. Our work has mostly focused on providing attorney representation to those in removal proceedings, most often for clients who are detained in US detention centers. But with the ever-changing landscape at our border over the last 2.5 years, we have transformed our work to address the needs of asylum seekers at the California-Mexican border. And this has included advocacy outside of the courtroom and representation of clients seeking asylum at the port of entry, primarily the San Ysidro port of entry, which is the busiest land crossing in the United States and the 4th largest in the world. When we began our work in 2018, what was beginning to happen at the border was this crisis happening in Central America for the most part. Rampant violence, climate change, all of these issues resulted in a mass exodus of asylum seekers trying to reach the United States for asylum protection. Let me begin by saying that to seek asylum in the United States is a right. It is provided by US law. And so everyone who seeks asylum may request that at a US border. However, during the Trump administration, we saw a massive plan, not only to eradicate immigration rights, but also a full-scale plan to dismantle the asylum system. Now, asylum is a protection that is afforded to those fleeing persecution. Persecution on the basis of race, religion, political opinion, membership in a particular social group. These are all legally interpreted terms and have encompassed persecution by not only government, but also private actors. And so in some cases, in many cases actually, there are folks who are able to receive asylum because of domestic violence, child abuse, persecution based on gender identity and orientation, and also imputed political opinion. These are just some examples in which asylum is granted. Also, gang-sponsored and gang violence in some cases have also been granted in the United States. And while issues of climate change are emerging, at this time, that's not a protected ground, although that is a reality that is not only plaguing our area of the world, but in many parts of the world and causing mass exodus. Although the US asylum law is complex and many interpretations and iterations that go beyond the scope of our talk today, but suffice to say that it is a difficult process to navigate, and especially difficult without legal representation. Back in 2018, when we started to see asylum seekers gather at the border, metering began to be implemented by US government officials. And metering is a process of queuing or putting people on a list to seek asylum at the US. And for some, I guess at first glance, that may seem like a reasonable tactic or a policy system to use to process a lot of asylum seekers. However, this process is not legal. And what ended up happening was a metering process that was largely controlled and handled by asylum seekers themselves. It was happening in cooperation under the radar or in cooperation with the US and Mexican governments. It resulted in thousands of people without a place to stay at the port of entry and being forced to remain there in large encampments and also at shelters where many have reached capacity. This metering list was put out a precarious situation for many and often allowed for people to become taken advantage. Violence erupted, corruption regarding lists, and many left to be taken advantage of. This metering list, in some estimates, had estimated 15,000, but I think it's actually quite more than that. And I'm talking about a metering list that was a piece of paper. Names, numbers, for many a hope to someday be able to ask for asylum, but being forced to remain in dangerous conditions in Mexico. I remember doing a Know Your Rights clinic in Mexicali back in 2019 and meeting several women, single mothers, who had kept crumpled pieces of paper with a number telling me that they were on a list, on a metering list. And this was held in their precious possessions, something they would not give up. And imagine their faces when I told them that that metering list would do nothing for them now, as by that time, the MPP program was beginning. In 2019, the Trump administration formalized its policies to dismantle the rights of asylum seekers, and what they implemented was called the Migration Protection Protocols, what we call MPP, or Remain in Mexico. What this did was essentially had individuals who are living in dangerous, precarious situations to apply for asylum while in Mexico, and then being brought into the United States for their immigration court dates. And for us in California, those courts were in San Diego, one of the courts that have the lowest asylum grant rates. Now, the asylum process, application process, is very difficult. It requires not only an application that is in English, but also evidence, supporting evidence to show that you've been persecuted or you fear persecution back in your home country. All of this evidence must be translated to English. So imagine going to a court, pleading for your life, explaining to a judge in a language that is not your native tongue, and explaining why you need protection and asylum for yourself and maybe for your loved ones. Now, this is not a non-adversarial process. It is an adversarial process. It's in a courtroom where the Department of Homeland Security, the trial attorney, a prosecutor, is trying to remove you or keep you away. And now this is a highly trained attorney who is trained to keep the border closed, essentially. All of this while trying to find a life and to remain safe in Mexico, a country that's not your own, with very little resources and humanitarian aid. Of estimates, apparently only 1% of MPP enrollees had counsel. For our office, we were quickly overwhelmed with requests for representation that went beyond our capacity. So with that, in 2019 and early 2020, we were dealing with an accelerated caseload and docket, many of these cases happening within 90 days, sometimes shorter. Many clients going, or many respondents or MPP enrollees going alone without any representation, not understanding any of the paperwork or rights that they have as asylum seekers. These evolution of these policies, this idea of closing the border to those who are most vulnerable, continued even throughout the pandemic with what we call now the Title 42, and which we will refer to, I think, many times throughout this presentation. But what Title 42 was once a little known law and health code, which allowed to exclude those who may have communicable diseases that could spread in the United States. And through this, what the Trump administration did was use this law to expel hundreds of thousands of vulnerable asylum seekers from the United States. And the way that they did that was through this guise of Title 42. And this is where we are now. Even despite guarded hope with the Biden administration, Title 42 still exists and is being used still to expel hundreds and thousands of asylum seekers who are still vulnerable. Throughout this, there have been some exemptions from the Title 42 process, including unaccompanied children and other exemptions for medical emergencies or other threats to life and safety. And so what has happened is the ACLU had brought a lawsuit, what we call the Alicia litigation, which had challenged Title 42 and allowed a limited number of daily folks to enter the United States through a Title 42 exemption process. And what this did was place an enormous burden on NGOs like ourselves to fulfill government gaps. Whereas this should have been a government cooperation with resources, what this ended up being was a burden that was placed onto legal service organizations like ourselves and other humanitarian organizations, both in the United States and in Mexico, to assess and act to provide the myriad of resources and services needed for these individuals. And so what we did is once that process began, we began trying to submit cases, most urgent cases through this process. Now that process has now ended, unfortunately, earlier this month. There has been other another effort by NGOs to also identify the most vulnerable cases, but that process also has a limited timeline. And since then, there is no other future or process guaranteed yet by the Biden administration on how to process in a humane, dignified, and safe manner for these asylum seekers. So throughout all of this, our office, which was once a public defender model to provide representation to those in immigration court, we began providing legal consultations both remotely and also providing accompaniment to the port of entry to help those who have been exempted through the process. But with that, there are thousands more who need help and who remain without any imminent form of relief at any time. So our phone lines began transformed into a hotline beyond our capacity. We have over 2,000 people who have called our hotline seeking assistance and guidance. And this is guidance that the government in its own right should have provided to these folks. There are encampments, shelters overrun, and have allowed this humanitarian crisis to not only continue, but to grow in scale. While the department has terminated the MPP program back in June, we have heard now that there are talks that a gentler, more kinder system, supposedly through the MPP, will be reinvigorated and restarted. And for us, I don't know what that will mean, but only that it will be another continuation of another failed effort to process these asylum seekers humanely. And what this feels like is the door that was never open will never be open again for asylum seekers at our borders. With that, I wish that I had more positive or glimmers of hope in this process, but in this week alone, we've not only seen the crisis in Haiti and Afghanistan, but now litigation tools by the state of Missouri and Texas to keep asylum seekers out. And now word of MPP restarting with the Biden administration. So I call upon all of you to contact your Congress members, to be engaged in these issues, and to fight and support our asylum seekers who are desperately in need. And so with that, I'll end my comments here and pass it back to Anna.
Joyce, thank you so much for a description of the work that you and your colleagues are doing. And thank you so much for representing asylum seekers who are some of the most vulnerable populations. Now I will go ahead and pass the floor to our colleague, Beth Strano from the International Rescue Committee in Arizona. Beth will be talking to us about the challenges her organization and other shelters are currently facing when hosting asylum seekers. She's going to describe a little bit of what the arrival process and welcoming process look like. Beth, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Anna. My name is Beth Strano. I am the Asylum Seekers and Family Senior Coordinator for the IRC here in Arizona. And I oversee the Welcome Center, which is our 24 hours emergency services shelter for asylum seekers and others who are being released from government custody. So far this year, we have served upwards of 17,000 people. And that has been an incredible year to be part of. It's also been an incredible feat to accomplish with our community. We have been able to do that because we work alongside so many strong community partners that are very engaged, including South Wellness, our medical clinic on site that's providing COVID tests to every single person that passes through the doors and making sure that they're safe to travel, and then also providing access to vaccines so that folks can get that Johnson & Johnson vaccine and not have to chase down a second shot in their new city. This year, we have seen people from 61 different countries, including 8 African countries. So we see asylum seekers from all over the world. And I think that people tend to think of our closest neighbors to the south in like Mexico and Central America when they think of asylum seekers, but there's conflict zones and displacement all over the world. Right now, we're receiving a large population of Haitians, which probably makes perfect sense to everybody on this call. And those are folks that really need the support and access to this this very important human right, which is the ability to seek safety, to leave the unsafe situation where you're living in and to seek it in another place. It's part of a commitment that the US has made to support asylum, but it's been a very tough couple of years to see that right actually upheld through policy and practice. This year, we are primarily seeing folks that are able to enter the country in spite of Title 42. So there are certain countries that we can't deport people to as a country. Those populations tend to get through. Primarily, about a third of the folks who are receiving right now are Cubans, and about another third are Brazilians. The other populations that make up the rest of the folks who are receiving, we are seeing a lot of folks from Haiti, Ecuador, Venezuela. We're also seeing folks from India, Romania, some folks from Uzbekistan. We have folks from all over, but overwhelmingly Cubans and Brazilians. And that has been, a huge challenge because they, fortunately they're able to get through, but we know that we're missing so many key populations that are waiting to access asylum on the border. We're not seeing any of the Central Americans. We're not seeing Guatemalans and Hondurans, and we know that they are waiting to cross. We work in Arizona as a community-driven effort that is regional. We are in very, very close communication with our partners down in Tucson and Nogales and Yuma. All of us are communicating on a daily basis. And so what we also know is when we talk to our partners on the other side of the border in Nogales, Sonora, at Kino Border Initiative, we know how many thousands of people are trying to get across and how many of them have really intense vulnerabilities, which should allow them access to the asylum process, even under Title 42. But there is a large amount of discretion applied to that kind of process. And the result is that they are not getting through. What we are seeing is some people being driven to very desperate decisions. One of those is to cross between the ports of entry, which in Arizona does not mean crossing a river, but it does mean potentially crossing a very deadly desert. And this has been one of the deadliest years in many decades for migrants trying to cross the desert and not surviving. We're also seeing a lot of families making very desperate decisions to send their children across unaccompanied and hoping that they will get access to safety, even if their parents won't, which is heartbreaking. I cannot imagine being pushed all the way to that point, knowing that you may never be reunited with that child, but having all of your hope that they will reach safety. This created earlier this year what we all heard in the news described as a crisis of unaccompanied minors at the border, and resulted in Arizona CBP building a lot of unaccompanied minors facilities, many of them tent cities essentially all along the border. Those unaccompanied minors were parts of families, and many of them, their parents were waiting on the other side, but could not access safety. And so this was something that was so avoidable through policy and reason, and applying some humanity to the way that we approach immigration. It's very devastating to see a family separated that may never be reunited. We also, in Arizona, we have 3 hotels that were put in place by the current administration that are managed by a company called Endeavors. And the Endeavors hotels were created as supposed to be a plan to help support more asylum seekers. The problem is that these were put in place without any input or interaction with the communities that they're being put into, and especially any input from the frontline providers that are already serving asylum seekers. So the model they came out with is actually an extension of ICE custody. Folks in the hotel cannot leave without incurring repercussions on their legal case, and they aren't allowed to leave their rooms while they're in the hotel. This is a very different model than what you see in the border shelters. There are many, many border shelters all along the border that have been providing services and support to asylum seekers for years. Some of them, like Annunciation House in El Paso, have been in place since 1978. And that kind of community depth of knowledge and support and interaction is so crucial to these kind of research, these kind of services. We cannot implement a 6-month emergency plan that will learn in that amount of time what our communities have been able to gain from years and years of doing this work. The other thing is that an emergency plan, like a pop-up shelter in a hotel or a pop-up detention center in a hotel, leaves at the end of the contract and everything goes with it. There's no lasting resource to the community, where the shelters just grow and grow because of the perspectives and the insights and the involvement of our community, and also the transparency, the access to lawyers that our partners with Florence Project can come in and meet with their clients on site. The ability for people to interact with all the different migrant support groups that we are lucky to have here in Phoenix, like our close partners at Transcorp Pueblo. Knowing that those resources are all part of what we can provide is what creates a more robust setting in a community-based shelter. But in these hotel models, people are in their room, they can't socialize with each other. They can't step outside and smoke a cigarette. They can't break bread together. It's a very isolating situation, and it is an extension of custody where they could have already been free. So we really strongly advocate for the government funding community-based shelters instead, and making sure that these models are sustainable. It's really important that when funding is redirected towards, an emergency resource, that often means that funding didn't go towards a more viable long-term resource. And what we can't afford to do is see border shelters close their doors. We are very fortunate that we're one of the bigger shelters along the border, but the partners that we have, like in the Holding Institute in Laredo, Texas, are so important and so good at what they do, even though they're very small. And that lack of funding is going to decide if they continue to exist or not. And the families and people that travel through those areas will be hurting for not having reached that warm welcome and reception. A lot of what we do within the shelters includes a legal orientation, helping them read through their papers, which are all in English, and explaining to them, this is what your ICE check-in is. That's what this means. This is where you're going to go. Here's how your court process will look, and this is what you need to know before you leave. We also provide them with resources at the city that they're going to end up living in, which for us, about 98% of people are leaving Arizona. So for all of them, they're going away from us, and we want to make sure that they have a warm reception there as well. If we didn't meet them at that point of contact, we currently see about 20% of the people we serve coming in with paperwork that's incorrect, that has the wrong city or state listed for their ICE check-in. How would they be able to successfully participate in their legal process if they don't receive the right information? We also see people come through that are very medically fragile, or that really have special needs that would not allow them to easily navigate a new country, a new transit system, the whole process of getting to New Jersey or to Texas or to Massachusetts without a little bit of extra help. And so we have the opportunity to make sure if they see a doctor before they leave, that maybe their prescription was taken away while they were in custody, we can get it replaced before they travel. Access to medical care in this country is a bad surprise for a lot of the folks that we receive. We want to make sure that those acute medical needs are served before they leave. All of these kind of resources are provided at all of the border shelters along the border, and that are just quietly and continuously doing the work. And so that's a huge message that we want folks to continue forward and escalate to your elected officials, is that we need community-based shelters. They're a resource. We grow from the perspectives and insights of our community, and we just continuously do better and better by folks. And it brings our community in to become witnesses and advocates themselves. That's a huge need, and we need our government to recognize an emergency pop-up is not the right approach. Asylum is not a disaster. It's not a crisis. Asylum is a human right and a need, and we should be prepared to always offer a humane response to asylum and bring people in and greet them with services, not custody. So that is the most important thing that we would like to carry on. Our biggest challenges are always trying to coordinate between DHS entities and other, communities, and get everybody to talk to each other. But Arizona has worked very hard to create that regional response that we think is replicable across the whole border, but it really requires the government to engage in it as wholeheartedly as possible. Without sharing information, none of us can serve families as easily. The humanitarian actors need to be at the table. They need to know when policies are changing, and their voices should be heard before policy changes, so that the possible unintended consequences of a policy change are actually heard and taken into account. And we are approaching a protection-centered approach to asylum. Right now, people are being processed almost like an assembly line, and not like, how is this individual person who needs safety going to get to safety? that is the direction we have to head. It's the direction that asylum is intended to serve. And so hopefully with all of you also lifting up your voices in that regard, we can be heard. And with that, I will close out unless there are questions.
Beth, thank you very much for that very thorough description of the work that you and your colleagues are doing. And thank you for touching on the difficult situations that asylum seekers are making while stranded in Mexico, that family separation and risking their lives to cross other parts of the border. I think it's something that we should definitely be aware of. And also understanding that once an asylum seeker is able to enter the US, their path of struggle continues. As you described, there are many challenges that they need to face: legal representation, access to social services, access to health. So thank you so much for reminding us about the existence of these challenges once asylum seekers enter the US. And our next guest speaker is Blake Vera from Raíces. Blake will be addressing the challenges faced by asylum seekers who are being sent to immigration detention. He is going to be describing the conditions of immigration detention and alternatives to immigration detention. Blake, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you for having me. Yeah, so basically, Texas is obviously a very large state. It is a very red state. We're a southern state and also on the border. Raíces is actually the largest nonprofit legal service provider for immigrants here in the state of Texas. We have our arms in a lot of different areas of immigration, whether it be social services. We actually do have a refugee resettlement department who is currently resettling numerous SIVs from Afghanistan. We have a social services department who helps folks who are outside of detention, connecting them to social services in their area. And the majority of our services are legal. We work in numerous detention centers here in Texas. Texas has a very large amount of detention centers, both concentrated in the metropolitan areas and also in the middle of absolutely nowhere. I am located here in San Antonio, Texas, which in Texas is the largest major city closest to the border. And so we see this really complex mixing of different entities who are all working with immigrants, and whether it's Border Patrol, DHS, ICE, there's a lot of things going on, which makes detention here in Texas really kind of volatile and very unsafe for people who are detained here. Raíces received a large amount of funds about 3 years ago through a fundraiser because of what was happening with zero tolerance family separation by the Trump administration, which is where family units were being ripped apart and children were being separated from their parents, going to completely different parts of the country at times, or being deported without their children. And Texas has 2 out of the 3 family detention centers in the United States where adults are detained with their children. Raíces does work in one of those detention centers in Karnes City in Texas. I have been to Karnes. Numerous colleagues of mine have also been to Karnes, and the conditions there are pretty deplorable. You could really go on. There's not really high access to medical care. If someone who is detained has some sort of medical issue, they're not really given access to a lot of things. Depending on where you're detained to, if you're detained somewhere in South Texas where a lot of the people who already live there and who may be employed by the detention center speak Spanish as their first language or as a second language, you might luck out in the sense that you can better communicate with who you need to communicate with, whether that be your deportation officer or whatever ICE officer is in the room with you. But there are detention centers here in Texas where people are not able to communicate at all, especially if you don't speak Spanish or if you don't speak another language that's widely represented. like what Beth was saying, a few years ago, we did see the majority of people who we were serving coming from Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. And now these things are kind of shifting just because of what's going on in the world right now. The majority of the people that we are getting phone calls now from are from Haiti, from Venezuela, and from Cuba. We also do have a lot of Brazilians who are contacting us as well. And, you know, you could really go on and on about how the intentional complexities of the immigration system are designed to make it harder for people to succeed and for people to navigate this immigration court system, especially while detained. Everything is designed to make it extremely hard. Detention centers in Texas are usually in the middle of nowhere. If you are lucky enough or have money to hire a private attorney, that attorney in the past would have to drive out there. Now you have to set up a virtual call, which, because you're communicating with ICE, who sometimes may not even answer the phone when you tried to call a detention center, it's extremely frustrating. And we at Raíces, we speak English. So, and we are familiar with the processes and we're familiar with trying to navigate these different things. And so if you can imagine someone who does not speak English, who may even be recently arrived and recently released themselves, trying to call these detention centers to try to get information about their family member, it's virtually impossible. You have to pay for an attorney. If you are in a detention center that does not have a legal service provider like Raíces or other various organizations here. We work in multiple detention centers. We have a team that is working in the Carnes Detention Center, working with families. And it is very difficult, like I said, because ICE, especially during the Trump administration, but even now continuing into the Biden administration, can almost do whatever they want because things change so drastically on a day-to-day basis. What happens is you usually have ICE officers who are on the very bottom of the totem pole when it comes to administration, interpreting very complex immigration laws based off of a memo or an email that they received that day. And because of that, they're really able to do almost whatever they want with the guise of just not answering the phone or just not being able to communicate things correctly to attorneys and to other people who are trying to help those who are inside. An example of this is a couple of years ago, we were helping a large group of women who were detained in Carnes Detention Center. Overnight, they were moved to another detention center in the middle of nowhere in Natchez, Mississippi. We were representing numerous women in this group. And for a few days, we had no idea where they were. They weren't showing up in the ICE locator, which is something online where you can put in someone's A number in order to find out where they are. And so all of these women were basically like cattle shipped off to other detention centers in Laredo in the middle of the Deep South. And so there's multiple tactics that ICE uses in detention here in Texas to kind of make it so hard. Outside the detention center, things are not a lot easier, just in terms of how corrupt and red the political system here is in Texas. Our governor is making it very hard for people who are helping asylum seekers here in Texas to do what they need to do. They're using scapegoating tactics, which we are very familiar with, to make it hard for people to transport migrants from the border. Because San Antonio is the largest city closest to the border here in Texas, we receive a lot of individuals who are getting released from the detention centers around San Antonio, but also people who are getting paroled directly from the border, people who are getting out of detention centers in the Rio Grande Valley. And so a lot of people actually just end up, for some other reason, at the San Antonio Greyhound station. We work with an organization called the Interfaith Welcome Coalition, who is there pretty much every single day doing amazing work, helping people print their tickets. We sometimes are able to meet people that we have helped at the bus station to go over their documents. And what me and my team do is we actually run one of the largest immigration bond funds in the United States. And at its basic core, bond for immigrants and bond for non-immigrants is roughly the same, but it also shows how unjust the immigration system is, and the fact that if you are in criminal detention or regular detention, and if you're offered a bond, you're usually able to pay like a certain percentage, 10% of that bond in order to get out. Immigrants usually have to pay 100% of those bonds unless they go through a predatory bond company. And so what my department does is we try to fundraise and use donated funds to help immigrants who have been granted bonds get out by paying this ransom basically that they have towards ICE. The minimum bond amount for someone who is in immigrant detention is $1,500. There is no maximum. So it was really up to the immigration judge or the ICE officer. And while they do supposedly take things into consideration, we have seen bonds that are $80,000. Imagine being an asylum seeker who is recently arrived. You have to pay for an attorney. You have to pay for so many other things. You do not have thousands of dollars in order to secure your freedom. And it just shows how unjust everything is, because you were able to navigate this very complex legal system within immigration while you are detained without access to so many things, including sometimes a phone. And all of that leads up to a judge finally giving you the key to get out of this cage, which is paying $10,000, paying $20,000. That is a thing that is completely corrupt. And that's something that we are trying to litigate with our bond fund. At the same time, we're trying to safely get as many people out of detention as possible through empowering the communities that we are working with on a daily basis. And so, yeah, things are really wild here in Texas, but that's just kind of what we can expect. But I think that those are all the points that I wanted to touch on. And again, thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to questions.
Blake, thank you so much for your summary. And I think for everyone, immigration detention it should end. And you reminded us of all the difficulties, the high rate of bonds, the difficulty of accessing clients who are detained. And we have a message from one of our participants that I would like for you to share with the whole team. We have Callie Weston from El Paso, who reminded us of volunteers who used to often pay visits to asylum seekers and be there as emotional support, because we know that they can be detained for months, years. So having the support of volunteers like Callie Weston is crucial. And we now know that these visits are no longer available or allowed. So Callie, thank you so much for volunteering your time and making those long drives to the detention centers that I know Blake is pretty used to and familiar with. So thank you so much, Blake. Please, to the audience, feel free to continue sharing your comments and questions. And we are going to go ahead and continue with our last two panelists. Who we have Luis Guerra and Reverend Noel Anderson, who are going to be talking to us about the Welcome with Dignity campaign and what efforts are being done at the national level to restore the asylum system. So Luis and Noel, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Anna, and it's a complete honor to be here with all of our colleagues doing such amazing work. And now we're going to take a couple steps back and talk a little bit about, in a grander, more global perspective, talking about a little bit of the work that we're doing at a national level through the Welcome with Dignity campaign, which is a national effort that brings together over 90 organizations who seek to reimagine our immigration system and defend the rights of those seeking protection. We really want to create a system and solutions that welcome families, children, and adults languishing at our doorstep, advocate for the restoration of asylum rights in the United States, and create a more just, humane, and dignified approach to protecting migrants fleeing danger. So as you heard from our colleagues and our partners with on-the-ground realities of today, unfortunately, many of these issues are not new. There have been decades of relentless assaults on and destruction of the U.S. asylum system, and we seek to demonstrate unequivocally that it's possible to welcome asylum seekers in a safe and fair manner, and that they should never be subjected to unnecessary and dangerous detention. We also acknowledge that humanely welcoming those seeking asylum requires change beyond the border. As we move forward with an already insufficient asylum system that was decimated by the Trump administration, rather than trying to restore a system that did not fully live up to our nation's value or meet the needs of the 21st century, we call for a transformed and re-envisioned asylum system that centers the well-being and dignity of all of the individuals seeking protection in the United States. So we have 4 concrete solutions that we're pushing for this administration and others to really help us complete this vision. First, we think we must start by ensuring that we're protecting people seeking safety at the U.S. border by restarting asylum processing and ending misguided, cruel, and illegal deterrence policies like Title 42 or MPP that really push folks back to danger and punish them for seeking protection and separate them from their families. Second, we want to launch and support a humane reception system overseen by humanitarian community-based experts like the one that we learned today through our colleagues at the IRC Welcome Center and many other colleagues that are at the border that are doing that welcoming work and have been doing it for many years. A system that really rejects the use of immigration jails or detention centers that we learned from our colleague at Raíces and provides community-based support so people understand their next step in their cases and while they wait for safety. Third, we want to build a more fair, effective, and timely immigration system that includes things like legal processes that are trauma-informed and that are not created to set people to fail. Ensure that all individuals have legal representation, as it's not currently an option for folks that don't have the resources, and that our immigration court system isn't such an arbitrary process, but rather restructured through new rules and laws that ensure protection consistent with refugee and human rights treaties, and an opportunity for asylum seekers to support themselves and their families while they wait for a decision. Lastly, just wanted to also ensure that our administrations are strengthening U.S. leadership on protecting refugees by supporting aid and foreign policies that respect human rights and addresses the reasons people are forced to flee from their countries, and developing new protections that respond to the emerging challenges like displacement caused by climate change. I'll pass it to my colleague, Reverend Noel Anderson, to talk a little bit more about the organizing work that we're doing with Welcoming Dignity campaign and how folks can get plugged in.
Great, thanks, Luis. So my organization, Church World Service, does have many different shelters in our network throughout the border, as well as many congregations that have been helping accompany asylum seekers. And several of the sanctuary movement cases we've been working on are also asylum seekers, and we've been trying to stop a lot of the deportations of people who are now facing deportation if they were denied their case or were in absentia. But Church World Service is part of this organizing team with Welcome with Dignity. And this is a very important campaign that Luis really laid out already. And I want to talk about some of the ways in which we're trying to engage people in taking action, in mobilizing and organizing. We know that the history of asylum is very important. It is part of our ancient tradition, going back to sanctuary, going towards now our US laws, our international laws, our conventions, but it's also part of who we are as a democracy, if we really want to call ourselves that. We know it's also part of our moral responsibility to welcome asylum seekers with dignity. And we cannot anymore allow the Biden administration to follow Trump's policies of misusing this public health code to block and essentially to block asylum in a way that where people can't even have a credible fear claim. Instead, they're getting expulsions back to unsafe, dangerous places. What is happening right now in Afghanistan is highlighting the need for the refugee program, for special immigrant visa, temporary and protective status, and asylum. These are critical life-saving programs. And in the case of the Northern Triangle in Central America, we're seeing that the gangs, the cartels, and the government officials, they are all mixing together. It's hard to tell the difference. And so this dire humanitarian need for those fleeing violence and persecution, we cannot turn our backs. So, already mentioned, we must lift Title 42 immediately. We must create a humanitarian reception infrastructure, welcome hubs, case management for people once they're in their destination locations. So we're going to share with you the welcome pledge that we hope that you would sign, that talks about taking that pledge to protect people seeking asylum at the border, to all of these demands, to welcome and to work alongside asylum seekers, to continue to advocate, to help them advocate and be standing alongside them to advocate for themselves. We're calling on the Biden administration to ensure a just, humane, and dignified asylum system. We also have a petition that really lays out these similar demands, demanding the welcome hubs, the humanitarian reception, but also providing legal representation and help with the work authorization, case support, case management support, all of these things in a fair and timely process for people seeking asylum. So, please sign the pledge, sign the petition. We really need these programs to have the significant funding. In fact, we're also part of a coalition called Defund Hate, where we're saying we need to defund ICE and CBP, instead put the same money into these types of programs that will help the community, like humanitarian reception. So we have been part of many different digital actions. Hopefully you all have taken part of those already with the digital toolkits and Twitter storms and call-in days. We've done vigils, we've done on-the-ground actions and marches, and we need to continue to do that. We need to continue to keep the pressure up on this administration, but we're also working to pivot to call on Congress to hold the Biden administration accountable. We are not seeing the type of action in response to our demands by the Biden administration that we would like to see. So that means we have to continue to call that out publicly, and we need to start really getting our congresspersons hearing from us even more so, letting them know that this is what we care about, and we expect them to hold the Biden administration accountable. So, please get involved in the campaign, do what you can, sign the pledge, sign the petition, think about, whether you want to do a vigil or an action or a virtual event, and we got to keep this up, keep the pressure up, keep the drumbeat going. And we're so glad to see all the different organizations on this call. And We Are All America, Opportunity for All of the important groups on the border doing the great work. That is the goal of Welcome with Dignity, is to bring these folk together to demand justice now, to restore asylum, to make sure there's no limits on asylum, and to bring justice back to this system. So I'll pass it back over to Anna.
Thank you so much, Luis and Noel, for the work that you both are doing with the Welcome with Dignity campaign. And thank you for reminding us about our moral obligation to hold the administration and Congress accountable, and for energizing us, Noel, with the points that you touched on, and to encourage us to, again, hold those responsible accountable to help us restore the asylum system. And lastly, I would like to introduce to everyone Frida Adams, who is representing New Mexico. And she is going to talk to us about what her local community and state are doing to welcoming asylum seekers, along with the challenges her community is facing. And Frida, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna, and good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate this opportunity to share a little bit about what's happening and what's not happening in New Mexico. So the asylum seeker situation and the asylum seeker response, it looks very different over here in New Mexico than it does in any of our neighboring states. And I just want to thank all of those who preceded me in presenting such a thorough and a clear picture of the situation, the challenges that we have, as well as the service and the ministry and the care that we give to asylum seekers traditionally. Currently, New Mexico has not received any asylum seekers since the MPP was enacted in fall of 2019. We were very busy receiving asylum seekers, and it all just shut like a big door when the MPP was enacted. So just a little bit about immigration for those of you who may be new to this or just here to try to start learning. Immigration is nothing new. People have been coming and going throughout Central America for hundreds and thousands of years. This was, at one time we were part of Mexico. And so the Camino Real del Centro, which is the historic path that was made from Mexico City up by the Spanish conquistadores, has been a pathway that for hundreds and hundreds of years, people have come to and fro. People who live here have traditionally accepted people into their homes. You can talk to anybody on the street and they'll remember their childhood when their mother or grandmother would have beans on the stove and feed people and have some tortillas and give them some water and a place to rest and pack them a little lunch and send them on their way as they migrated to and from. The words asylum seeker are kind of historically new for us, but they're migrants. They were called, caminantes, walkers. So the events themselves are not new. What is new is the political attention and the increased security, especially after 9/11. So as far as faith-based organizations and churches, they really got more involved in this about 40 years ago, and it's about the same timeline as Annunciation House, which is about 30 minutes down the road over in Texas, in El Paso. So we have worked traditionally in conjunction with them to receive asylum seekers and care for them and get them on their way as needed. During the 5 months that the surge was at its highest in New Mexico in 2019, during those 5 months, we received 17,000 asylum seekers, processed them, cared for their medical needs, got their plane tickets or bus tickets, and got them safely to their destinations without losing one soul. And I'm so grateful for that. And that's a testament to the high quality of care and concern that our volunteers and our churches and our medical providers and everyone had. So we're grateful for that. So again, as I said, we do work in partnership with Annunciation House over in El Paso, and Ruben Garcia, the director, coordinates really well with CBP and ICE to find out how many people need to be released. We let him know what our capacity is, how many people, how many beds we have available, and he assigns numbers and destinations to all of our shelters, and they bring them safely to us. And so that's always worked really smoothly and efficiently when all is going well and everybody's communicating together. But unfortunately, COVID hit, and the surge. And if anybody knows anything about New Mexico, we're at the wrong end of every graph that measures quality of life, well-being, education, personal safety, domestic violence, you name it. We got a lot of challenges here. This county that I live in here on the border, Doña Ana County, is the poorest county in the United States. So even though we're poor, we're consistently listed as the most generous city in the United States by March of Dimes. These people really care. And I think one of the reasons they're so generous, even in their own need, is because their histories are very closely tied to the asylum seekers. Someone in their family, their immediate family, their grandmother, their parents, someone has made that journey before them to give them this life that they have here. So closely tied together with asylum seekers historically. But unfortunately, with our critical shortage of doctors already on our best day and healthcare workers on our best day, we don't have enough. as well as a strained hospital capacity, especially along the border. Combined with our lack of transportation hubs, we don't have big bus stations and airports here. We have to take people over to El Paso to get them out about 45 minutes away. All of that combined, our governor made the decision back in February that no state resources will be used to provide care for asylum seekers at this time. She's encouraging the federal government to provide this care, as immigration is a federal responsibility, and New Mexico must put caring for New Mexicans during the COVID crisis as their focus. As our shelters consist of modest churches and ministries, we're unable to manage positive COVID cases or house people for a length of a quarantine. We just don't have that kind of capacity. We depend on the Department of Health and their Medical Reserve Corps volunteers for medical support. And unfortunately, they are already stretched to the maximum with testing and vaccinations. And now we have boosters coming up, and we're in another surge. So all of this just means we can get minimal support from them, and we really can't count on it. So we're heartbroken. We're heartbroken. We want to receive. Many of our volunteers are going over to Annunciation House, making that drive to try to help them out over there in El Paso while we're closed here. But the bright spot in all of this has been the formation and flourishing of the New Mexico Hospitality Coalition, which is a group, the group of churches and faith-based organizations here in Las Cruces that got together in February of 2019 when everything started ticking up and the numbers started going up. And I just called a bunch of the churches and said, can you send somebody over? Let's talk about coordinating rides to the airport. And so out of that began a collaboration and a coordination that has been amazing. So as the surge in 2019 got into full swing and the numbers just totally collapsed, our churches and our faith-based shelters, and they had to open in the city and the high school, and we just had hundreds of people coming everywhere. It was this coalition that was able to pull together and do the coordination, bringing the right people to the table to have discussions and make coordinated plans. And we have grown from that group of 6 people around the table to many weeks we have 50 or more on Zoom. So we've ridden through, the shutdown, the lockdown, and can't get together. And we meet together every Wednesday morning at 10 a.m. Mountain Time to have Hospitality Coalition meeting. And we have local, state, NGO, federal agencies, shelters from other states, our shelters, and field officers from our elected officials. All of us come together. We're all together in the same Zoom room. We're sharing updates. We're asking questions. We're all getting answers together. And it's a wonderful way to keep up and keep our care coordinated and our plans coordinated. We were able to also put together processes, and the rapid medical triage, the travel triage was put together here by our doctors at our residency program at a local hospital that has been shared widely across the border. It's been adopted, at least here in New Mexico, as the travel triage use. So and the training that we have done for all the Hospitality Coalition shelters means that any volunteer can walk into any shelter in the state of New Mexico, and they're going to be using the same forms, the same processes. And so we can quickly adapt and move volunteers to the need. We've registered hundreds of people and background checked them, also vetted their licenses. We've standardized some trainings and given group trainings. We've had FEMA trainings. We've had one of the things I'm most proud of that as we get ready, for doing this again, has been our New Mexico Children, Youth, and Families Department, which is our child welfare department, has worked together, moved heaven and earth. If anybody works for state government, you understand how difficult this is, to develop and approve a rapid, expedited registration and clearing of temporary foster families that would be able to care for children that are in our shelters with their families, and they become unaccompanied because their parents or parent has had to go to the hospital themselves or be with a sibling in the hospital, which leaves a child alone in our shelters. And so being able to set a system where those people that would take them into their home our licensed temporary foster families, and also CYFD, Save the Children, and HSI have worked together to provide combined training for the volunteers in human trafficking, child safety, and other pertinent issues so that we all do a better job of protecting the people in our care. Our coalition has also been pivotal in bringing a multi-agency task force together to develop a statewide coordinated plan for asylum seeker care. And we got it ready to go. All we need is people on the ground. So, but we're ready. I just want, if you remember anything from my talk, New Mexico Hospitality Coalition shelters are ready, we're willing, and we're able to receive. This is our calling, this is our mission, this is our heart. And so I ask that you advocate for us, and I ask that you pray for us that we're going to be able to open up and care for asylum seekers. They're there, folks. They're all just across the border. Just because they're not in our shelters don't mean they don't need us. They need us more than ever. We get regular reports from across the border, and the violence and the scarcity and the tragedy that unfolds on the other side of the border when we don't get these folks in. So I want to thank you for allowing me a few minutes to talk with you, and I've enjoyed listening to everybody else. It's good to see you guys. Thank you.
Frida, thank you so much for your words. I think your coalition and members of your community in New Mexico are a perfect reminder of what we as a nation stand for. Thank you for dedicating, it sounds like dedicating your life to these projects. Where do you get your energy from? But we
the passion of doing what we do.
Exactly. And I think we felt the passion that you have. Thank you so much for all the work you're doing. It must be very hard to feel and see that you and your coalition are ready to serve, and to know that the asylum seekers are very close to you, but they're on the other side of the border. So I hope that you transfer this message to the coalition of how grateful we are to have people in our communities like you, because if it wasn't for you, our asylum seekers would be in limbo even after entering the United States. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
And now we still have some time. I would like to open up the floor and the chat function. If anyone who is watching us either through this platform or through Facebook, if anyone has any questions, please feel free and comfortable to paste them in the chat. We will happily address them and answer them. And while we wait for some of our questions, I would like to ask a question to Joyce. With this recent, maybe rumor, if you want to call it that, about the Biden administration introducing something similar to MPP, what challenges would this bring to your organization, or how would your organization represent individuals who are stranded in Mexico if your team is in the US? How would that type of work look like?
Yeah, so there are reports that the Biden administration intends to craft or reinstitute MPP, or what they call, quote, a gentler MPP system. And I really can't imagine what they would do to a system that forces people to remain in Mexico while they are seeking asylum. So there hasn't been much shared as to the features. I think they're indicating a process of which people can parole out of that system. But again, looks very much similar to what was happening pre-pandemic with the MPP program. For an organization like us, we do have an office in San Diego, very close to the border. And I think what would happen in all likelihood, and we're seeing this in other immigration spheres and what they've called these dockets or case handling mechanisms to accelerate these claims. And so I imagine that we will see much of the same features that we saw with the Trump administration, although it will be using language that is somewhat, more convincing. That is a gentler process, maybe allowing for people to opt out or be paroled out of it. But that's something that was already in existence in its first iteration. And so for us, I see much of the same challenges. It is very difficult to represent individuals who are also battling life-saving necessities. If they do not have a safe home, if they're constantly worried every day about the safety for themselves and of their loved ones, it's very hard to work and concentrate on an asylum case. And an asylum case for us is a full-fledged litigation process. And so there's evidence, there's testimony to prepare, there's country conditions. We're facing an opponent, the Department of Homeland Security, who does not, whose role is to be a prosecutor. And so I imagine it will look a lot like it did. And so I'm not, optimistic that, this program in its 2.0 version will be too different from what it was. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you. Let's hope that doesn't happen and we don't have to look for plans for that. And for Noel and Frida, what would you tell someone who is looking for volunteer opportunities or for a way to get involved with your community or with a group that is helping asylum seekers? How can someone start becoming involved in this type of volunteer work or in this type of environment?
We love volunteers. That's how we do what we do. I'm a volunteer. So my email is in the chat. If there are many ways to volunteer. If you've got a heart for this, there's a place for you. If you'll text me, or email me, we'll have some conversations and we'll see where you best fit. Anything from giving me a half a day to collecting in your community, maybe collecting donations or spreading the word if you can't get here. There's all kinds of things you can do. You can come and spend a couple of weeks with us. There have been people who have moved here, especially medical volunteers. Our New Mexico Board of Medical Examiners, again, anybody who's worked in that field will know exactly what happened, the miracle that happened here last time. They got together and they made some exceptions to expedite full medical licenses for physicians that wanted to come and volunteer. So it was a full licensure, unrestricted. It wasn't you could come for 2 weeks and leave. You can move here, you can retire here. So that is a tremendous benefit for folks. Their nurses can come under their compact license. Most states, I'll work with you. I'm an RN, I can help you. Just send me an email and let's get that conversation started and see how you can help.
Yeah, for me, I would say, all of the volunteer, all the ways you can volunteer are really great. We do tend to see people kind of get in their space of like, okay, I'm gonna, volunteer at the welcome center or the shelter, or I'm gonna go down to the border and serve folk, or I'm gonna do the like calling the congressperson and the accompanying, those things need to all come together when possible. When people have real life experiences and have heard the stories or walking alongside, accompanying somebody, it is also critical that they do the advocacy work and the organizing work. So, bringing together people in your region around a virtual or in-person event, making sure that your congresspeople, your senators know about that event and that the media knows about it, engaging the media with letters to editor and opinion editorials when you're able to, and or contacting the leaders, your local elected officials to get them to voice up more. All of these things trickle up all the way up to the administration, and we really need to do all of the above when we're able to. And I know that's a big ask, so it is kind of figuring out where do you fit in, but not falling into a silo, but seeing the broader picture and the need for systemic change as well as the need for the direct service.
Thank you both. And we have a question in the chat from Naira, and it's directed to representatives from Texas, Arizona, and California. What is the average number of asylum seekers you receive on a daily basis? And and how can people help in your states?
I can chime in from Arizona. Right now in Phoenix, we're receiving about 250 to 300 people a day up in Phoenix. and Tucson, I know they're typically receiving about 100 to 150 people per day. Then we know that the Yuma port of entry is processing about, not at the port, but in their sector is processing about 400 people a day. And some of those folks are being released directly in Yuma to a coalition of health partners who are testing them and helping them move on without reaching one of the shelters as well. And so overall, entirely across the state, my best guess would be about 500 people per day being processed through humanitarian efforts. And as far as getting involved, whatever city you're in, unless you're very far north, there is a great program to plug into. Actually, even really far north, I know in Flagstaff, there's a search and rescue group that comes and does search and rescue in the desert. So if you're from anywhere in Arizona, there's a way to get involved. You can always email us. I'm going to throw Welcome Center volunteer email in the chat, because we can also connect you to any of our partners across the state if you are in Arizona and you're looking to plug in.
I think I can go next for California. For us in California, we're a legal services organization, so we're providing legal services. And I can say in terms of like asylum seekers that we see every day, daily, our lines are averaging about 50 to 75 callers a day. Some are repeat callers, but for the most part, they are new callers and new folks seeking legal assistance or some information, any information really. And the way to get involved with us, with Immigrant Defenders, we are always in need of volunteers for language. So Spanish speakers, French, Creole, those are our languages right now that we're most in need. It allows us to continue to provide more services. All of our staff right now is Spanish speaking. And so if anyone has language capacity in those other languages, we would welcome that. And this is work that can be done remotely. So we're doing all of our legal consultations and legal work remote. And if necessary, we will go to the port of entry to accompany folks through the processing part. Thank you.
And from Texas, the team that I work on is kind of monitoring like a national hotline. So we mainly deal with people who are calling, asking for help for bond. I can tell you that my team has had more than 100 calls within the last 2 weeks, just of people who are needing bond help. And the main detention center we work in Pearsall, Texas, averages about 800 detained individuals every single day. And so, and then from the border, I would expect that we interact with several thousand people every single week.
Thank you. And Beth, I'm not sure if you would like to touch a bit on testing and vaccines. Go ahead.
Yes. So there's a question in the Q&A about, can we ask for DHS to test and vaccinate at the border? This is one of those things that does sound like it would be super productive, but the reality is that in a lot of those situations, it could actually extend government custody. I think it's fair to ask DHS through another branch, such as FEMA, to provide testing and vaccinations upon release. But if we ask CBP or ICE to provide those things, there's a very strong likelihood that somebody who tests positive is going to have to quarantine in custody. And when we talk about a family, say we have a family of 4, if they're in quarantine together, then potentially each person being tested is going to delay several days. Somebody could be negative at the beginning and then positive after a while. So what we would prefer is that folks exit government custody as soon as possible so that they have freedom of movement and then receive access to those health resources upon release. Right now, there's a great coalition in Yuma, the Rural Center for Border Health, that has been providing exactly those resources for everybody that CBP street releases in Yuma, and have just had incredible results with people accessing the vaccine, getting their tests, making travel decisions based on that test. All of the border shelters, for the most part, as far as I know, all the border shelters are providing testing as well. And many of them are now also offering vaccines, including our shelter. And so I think it's that point of release is what we want to look for, and not necessarily the point of custody.
Thank you, Beth. And thank you to everyone. I think that we are getting close to wrapping up our conversation. First of all, thank you to everyone who registered and who is attending the event. I'm sure the panelists, myself, and the organizers are very grateful for your time and for your interest on this very important matters. To the panelists, I know how busy you all are. Thank you so much for participating in this conversation. And also thank you to Neira and Andres, who are on the background, making sure our mics and cameras work properly. Please take care, everyone. Thank you so much for joining, and see you all soon. Have a good night, everyone.